everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. If you'd like to join us here in the room, you'll find the schedule for upcoming sessions at lindanickell.com/happiness hour. While you're there, please consider signing up for our monthly newsletter. Tonight's guest is Liron Gertsman. Liron is a distinguished nature photographer and conservationist whose stunning imagery brings the beauty of the natural world into sharp focus. Based in British Columbia, Liron's work has earned international acclaim, receiving honors from prestigious platforms such as Audubon Photography Awards and the Wildlife Photographer of the Year honors, where his photographs were featured in world-renowned institutions like the Natural History Museum in London and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He's a passionate advocate for environmental preservation. His photography aims to inspire action and raise awareness about the pressing need for conservation. Beyond his personal work, Liron also offers immersive photography tours and workshops where he combines his extensive knowledge of wildlife and photography to create unforgettable experiences for participants. You can connect with him through his website at lirongertsman.com. And if you're on Instagram, you can find him at Liron_Gertsman_photography. And I'm going to link those in the show notes, so it'll be a little easier for you to get to his pages. But in tonight's presentation, Wildlife in a Unique Light, Liron will offer behind-the-scenes stories from the field. He'll delve into the ecological significance of the wildlife he photographs, and he'll discuss valuable insights on photographic planning, creativity, and technique. Welcome to the Happiness Hour, Liron.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Very generous.
You're welcome.
Um,
So how many times did I mispronounce your name?
no, you did great. You honestly did fabulous. That was great. I'll go ahead here and share my screen.
Hang on.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go back. Okay, it's fine. Did I miss anything? Do you want to share anything? Add to the whole, dossier of cool stuff you've done.
No, I appreciate the introduction. Maybe I'll tell people a little bit more about how I got into photography, but we'll get into that in a moment here.
Okay, all right. In that case, go ahead.
All right. Well, hello everyone. Thanks again, Linda, for the very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure and treat for me to be here today. I obviously love getting out in nature and photographing and documenting wildlife, but something you will also, I'm sure, see in the coming hour is that I'm also very passionate about getting to share these stories and educate and just have fun kind of engaging with people in the topics of wildlife and in the topics of photography. So just to tell you a little bit more about my photography journey, for me, it all started from a very young age. So I have basically been obsessed with the outdoors for as long as I can remember, as long as I've been alive. And I began taking photos when I was quite literally about 4 or 5 years old. My parents growing up had a little point and shoot camera, and that camera would be used by the family to take pictures of the family. But I grew up here in Vancouver, British Columbia. There's a lot of beautiful parks and green spaces. And very often we would go out for walks in the parks with that camera. And I would want to use that camera to take pictures, not so much of the family, but I would be borrowing that little point and shoot camera to try to photograph the things like the ducks and the crows and the geese and the things that we would see in the parks. And my earliest photos that I have from birds were right around my 5th birthday. So it's something that I've been doing my entire life. Nowadays, I love to get out and explore places like this. This is a photo of me in the field in Kluane National Park up in the Yukon. Um, I did study biology to get a bit of an academic background too. I was already very nerdy and passionate about ecology and wildlife biology and all that, but I did study biology at the University of British Columbia. And now, as Linda mentioned, I work full time as a professional wildlife photographer and as a guide, guiding wildlife photography trips and as an educator. So without further ado, I'll jump into showcasing some of my photos and some of my stories here. And we're going to start right where I call home, which is here on the British Columbia coast. I largely credit my love of the outdoors and of wildlife photography too, having been so fortunate to have been raised here in this amazing place, which is the British Columbia coast. I don't know, I'm sure it sounded like maybe a couple people here are from the British Columbia coast, so you know how lucky we are. If you're not from the British Columbia coast, I encourage you to come visit the British Columbia coast because this is a fabulous place, home to some amazing wildlife. And I think when people think about this place, they're often first drawn to, what we call the big charismatic megafauna. Things like the humpback whales. This is a beautiful humpback whale breach. This is probably maybe the favorite humpback whale breach I've ever seen. What happened was it was on one of my it was actually one of my bald eagle photography workshops that I do every summer out of Vancouver Island. But on those trips, we also spend a lot of time with a lot of other wildlife like whales, and we watched this whale breach, and it made this big splash, and it happened out of the blue, so like no one got the shot. But this big splash is in the air, and whenever whales breach, I always tell people keep your camera up, even if you missed it, keep ready because very often either the same whale breaches again or another whale will breach afterwards, like very, very often. So we had our cameras up, and then a second whale breached directly in front of the splash of the first whale, right at sunset, and that's the scene that you see here. So that was absolutely beautiful. Whenever possible, I like trying to kind of incorporate not just an amazing action moment, but also some interesting lighting, like the backlights, and some of the environment as well. For me, is very important whenever possible. Now, that was an amazing day on the workshop. Everyone's like, I don't know how we're going to top that humpback whale breaching at sunset. And then the next day, this happened. Um, Something very, very simple. This was a humpback whale. There was a few of them in a really quiet cove, kind of in the evening hours, just sleeping and coming up to the surface every now and then and breathing. And with even though the whales were not that active, they weren't jumping out of the water, pretty much everyone on the trip agreed that this was even more spectacular. Just the backlight lighting up the breath and the serenity, the calm water, the sound of the whale breathing. It was just a magical evening. And another example of how lighting is so, so important. What is going on here is that breath from the whale is being lit from behind by the sun, but the backdrop behind, which is also being reflected on the water, is completely in the shade. So it was possible to get this beautiful, like high contrast scene with the whale breath sticking out in front of that dark background. Now, like I said, it's fun to talk about the big charismatic megafauna, like the whales. But as someone who is a big ecology nerd, I like to talk about every layer of the food chain. And the thing that draws these whales to our local waters is actually the smallest, most microscopic organisms that you can think of, plankton. This is actually just a photo I captured with my phone of through a microscope of just what our water here looks like. Our water here in the summertime is very murky, and that's because it is full of just huge quantities of plankton. And the whales, these big humpback whales, are feeding on these plankton in the water, and these plankton are the base of this entire coastal food chain. And when it comes to documenting stories about a place, as fun as it is to photograph that big charismatic megafauna, I do like to kind of capture all stages of the ecosystem. For example, maybe when the whales aren't so active, I love to go into a beach and look at the treasure trove of life that you find on the beach. These are goose barnacles and northern bay mussels. This is a pretty standard view on kind of the west coast of British Columbia of what all our beaches look like. And these animals eat the same stuff that the whales eat. They are filtering plankton out of the water. And there's some incredibly colorful things as well. It can be nice to go to the beach with a macro lens, and just the amazing diversity of life. That's a chitin in the top left. That's the shell of an abalone on the top right, a sea slug or a nudibranch on the bottom left, and a close-up of a sea anemone on the bottom right. So these textures are all also amazing. And so this really nutrient-rich water feeds this incredible food chain, everything from as small as these little beach intertidal organisms all the way up to the big humpback whales, which we're very lucky to have here. And it's a big conservation success story because just a few decades ago, they were quite rare on the coast of British Columbia. Commercial whaling for decades, or even centuries, had really decimated their populations. But with the ban of commercial whaling, throughout the 70s, 80s, they've started to resurge and return back to their old homes, and we now have huge numbers of humpback whales spending the summer, but even all through the year on the coast of British Columbia here, which is very special. Now, the coast here is not only special for the marine wildlife, it is also an amazing place for birds. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, all of this really began with the birds. My home here happens to be on the Pacific Flyway, which is a bird migration superhighway. So it's this basically this general route that every year millions and millions and millions of birds travel between their nesting grounds up far north, in Alaska, northern Canada, in the Arctic, all of them, some of them all the way far as south as, southern South America. And that means throughout the year, we get some incredible bird migration spectacles. Big flocks of shorebirds are a favorite of mine. These are dunlin. We get flocks that can number tens of thousands of dunlin. And this photo here was taken right at dusk, so after the sun sets. Beautiful kind of pinkish pastel-y light. Sunrise and sunset are obviously my personal favorite times to photograph. You'll probably see that in a lot of my photos. And the technique I use here, you see the wings are kind of blurred. This is a slow shutter speed technique. So I think it was something like a 30th of a second, basically panning, following the movement of the dunlin as they fly. Because I'm matching the speed of the dunlin flying, they're nice and sharp. But because I'm using such a slow shutter speed, the wings are all really blurred. And it kind of showcases the movement. Here's another example of that same technique with a flock of snow geese. This is another bird that we get in huge numbers migrating down the Pacific Flyway. Again, this was maybe like a 20th or so of a second. And as the flock took off because an eagle swooped over, I specifically purposefully used this slow shutter speed technique to capture that chaos and that blur of the wings. So whenever I'm photographing things, I'm always looking for unique perspectives. So this is an example of a flock of snow geese captured traditionally with well, maybe not traditionally in terms of shutter speed, but traditionally in terms of, this was maybe at 400 millimeters, right? This is a pretty telephoto shot. But when the opportunities arise, I also like to get creative with the focal lengths that I'm using. Here's a shot of some snow geese captured with a wide angle lens. This was at 14 millimeters. Now, the snow geese we get here, some of them can be pretty used to people and can get quite close, but not quite this close. So what I did here is I observed these patterns that there are favorite fields and grassy areas where snow geese like to gather. And often what happens is a few start gathering in the field. And then when other birds fly over, they see those birds that are already in the field and they keep flying in to land in that field. Well, when I saw a few snow geese gathering at the side of this field, I crawled in there with my camera and I set it up wide angle just on a little ground tripod. And I used a device called a Cam Ranger, which allows me to remote control the camera settings and take pictures using my phone. So I set it up, I backed off, maybe like 100 yards away, and I controlled the camera with my phone. And as the geese flew in, again, they're not too shy, but I couldn't have been like right below them there. I needed to be a little bit further away if I wanted to get this perspective. I used the remote control to get this photo kind of within the flock as they all came in for landing. And yeah, I see the keen-eyed comments in the chat. You can see another person on the left side of the screen there taking a picture with a phone. And I actually thought about, should I crop out this person or, cut them out of the frame? But I like to capture photos that tell stories. And to me, part of the story of the snow geese that migrate through Vancouver is that they are very much amongst kind of the people, and people stop and observe them. And so for that reason, I decided I would keep that person in the background in the distance there in the frame. I was probably similarly positioned, just a little bit further to the left. And we've looked at some water birds that migrate through my area here. We also get little birds, and actually right now, as we speak, we are seeing the arrival here of the little songbirds like the rufous hummingbirds. Now, the lighting in this photo was pretty special. This was when I was studying still at the University of British Columbia before I graduated. I think it was actually my 4th year, so right before I completed my undergrad. And a friend of mine found this beautiful patch of red flowering currants, which is this native flower that you see in the picture here. And every evening, dozens of hummingbirds in April would come and feed on these flowers. And it was just so beautiful to see all these hummingbirds buzzing around. And they would be particularly active right at dusk when it was starting to get really, really dark. And when I went at dusk, I noticed that the main light source on these flowers actually was the street lights, because this was right along a walkway. So it was actually the street lights lighting up the scene. So this photo here is basically entirely lit by just the street lights that are lighting up the walkways at the University of British Columbia. And my technique here was it's really hard, especially in that low light, to like follow around hummingbirds and try to track the hummingbirds. But one thing I often do with my wildlife photography is when things are challenging, I just take a step back for a moment and I observe. And I'm like, okay, what are the behaviors going on here? Are there any repetitive patterns? What are the things that I can notice? And one thing that I noticed here is that if I watched for long enough, basically every single flower on these bushes would be visited by a hummingbird. There were like a dozen or maybe even 20 of them. So like every single flower would get visited. So instead of trying to follow around the hummingbirds, I just set my camera up on these flowers that you see here because the lighting was the nicest on them and they were just beautiful, fully in bloom. And I positioned myself so there'd be just like a distant dark background that didn't have any light on it. And sure enough, just a few minutes later, this rufous hummingbird came right into where I was waiting, and I was able to capture this photo. Now, one final bird species I want to feature here before I move on to some other wildlife on the coast are bald eagles. And believe it or not, we actually get the biggest bald eagle gatherings on Earth here in southwestern British Columbia. We hold the record. Close to 10,000 eagles counted in a single day is that record, and that's in the Fraser Valley. Um, but that's not the only bald eagle gathering. We get lots of different bald eagle gatherings, huge numbers of bald eagles at many different times of year. It's possible to see hundreds, or in some cases even thousands of bald eagles gathered, and they're always gathered due to some type of food source. Now that can range from landfills, as majestic of a reputation as these birds have. They are very opportunistic and they will scavenge garbage. Often you get big gatherings around the salmon run, which we'll talk about in a moment. But my personal favorite gathering of eagles for photography here, it takes place every summer, like June, July time. And we get really strong tidal currents passing through some of the coastal islands near Vancouver Island. And it creates these zones of upwelling where you get lots of fish coming up to the surface of the water, and hundreds of bald eagles gather to feast on these fish, primarily hake, which is a fish in the cod family. And it's just this super dramatic spectacle with these eagles swooping in and grabbing the fish. And it's become one of my favorite annual trips. It's one of the trips that I do an annual photography workshop around, kind of based around these strong tides and the eagles that come and catch the fish during the strong tides. Some days there's just hundreds of eagles fishing all at once. And it's the type of thing where it's like, I don't even know where to point my camera lens because there are so many eagles flying around in all directions. It's really a remarkable sight. And to me, what makes it so special for photography is that oftentimes eagles are scavengers. So they're not going after prey in like that dramatic of a way. They're just kind of looking for garbage in the landfill or they're eating carcasses. Whereas here they are swooping down and grabbing fish off the surface of the water, the fish that get brought up to the surface by these strong currents. So it's just a very stunning, natural, dramatic phenomenon. But again, it's not just about the close-ups, it's also about the environment. And I always look to capture photos as well that showcase birds within the context of their environment, especially a place like the coast of British Columbia here, which is so beautiful. Now, moving on, kind of connecting to the eagles here, the biggest gatherings of bald eagles on the coast here occur because of the salmon run. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the salmon run, every year we get salmon that are out in the ocean coming up the rivers and streams here on the coast of British Columbia. And they're actually returning to the very places that they were born, where they will lay eggs, fertilize those eggs, and it's typically a one-way trip. So typically after they spawn in the rivers, they die. But then those carcasses go on and feed a multitude of life, which we'll look at in a moment here. But it's this incredible journey. These salmon are born in the freshwater rivers, they live their life in the ocean, and then they return not just to any rivers, they return to the exact same rivers where they were born at the end of their life. And along the way, they feed a multitude of life. Bald eagles are one of those. Again, massive bald eagle gatherings attracted to the salmon run every year. But also, when you start to get into the more remote areas on the coast here, some amazing other wildlife species can be found. This is one of the more rare and elusive species. I'm thrilled when I can encounter one of these. This is a wolf, a coastal wolf. We have this incredible, unique population of wolves here on the coast of British Columbia that primarily eat seafood. So that includes salmon, and it includes crabs and seals. They also will catch deer and things like that, but they really, a huge part of their diet is seafood, which is really incredible. A lot of people don't realize that wolves will catch fish, but they absolutely do here on the coast of British Columbia. Now, the main place where I photograph wolves these days is up on the north coast of British Columbia, this area known as the Great Bear Rainforest, which perhaps you've heard of. It's an amazing place. And it's another place where I'm very lucky to get to go guiding wildlife trips there every single year with my guests. And we sometimes see wolves, though not every trip. It takes some luck. One animal we do see every trip, though, are bears. And there's an incredible, healthy population of bears in the Great Bear Rainforest. And they are drawn there for a very good reason, which is the amazing abundance of salmon that arrive every single fall to the region. I call this photo here bear hug because it kind of looks like the bears giving the salmon a big hug. But I feel like this photo nicely showcased just how big that salmon is. That's a big chum salmon. So one of the treats, I guess, of being a guide in this region is, I get to visit every year, but getting to go back every single year comes with some advantages because I get to know the individual bears. And this is a huge blessing to get to see the same individual bears every year. And every bear has its own personality. But my two favorite bears for the last few years have been these two siblings. Um, this is them this past fall. They are 3 years old in this photo here, but I first met these two when they were yearling cubs, just less than a year old with their mom a few years ago. And then I saw them again the subsequent year still with their mom. And then this summer was the first year that they were on their own, which is to be expected. Bear cubs usually spend about 2.5 years or so, 2 to 3 years with their mom. So they were in their third year. So they were all on their own. But these two siblings were still glued together. They were spending all their time together. You never saw just one. They were always together and they were doing tons of play fighting. And that is exactly the type of excitement and action that really provides for remarkable, photo opportunities, these dramatic moments of action between these two siblings. So I did 3 Great Bear Rainforest tours this past fall, and we saw them every single trip. They're they were just such a joy to watch and spend time with. Of course, when they're here, they're just kind of play fighting in the river, and they were play fighting nonstop. And then they get out of the river and do a big shake off whenever they're wet, just like a dog, which is another very dramatic moment for action, for getting action photos. So the grizzly bears are always a big highlight of my trips to the Great Bear Rainforest for sure. Just such a treat to see them in their element, catching the salmon. But they're not the only bears that we see. On the big river estuaries, those are dominated by the grizzly bears because they're big and strong, and they force the other bear species, which is the black bear. They generally force those guys a little bit more out to some of the islands and the smaller rivers and the smaller streams. So you find the grizzly bears more on the mainland estuaries and the black bears more on the islands with the smaller rivers. Now, the Great Bear Rainforest, though, is known for not just black bears, but a very, very rare mutated black bear known as the spirit bear. Perhaps you have heard of the spirit bear. This is what they look like. So they are black bears, but they are black bears that carry a rare double recessive mutation, not that dissimilar from something like blue eyes in humans. They carry this rare double recessive mutation that turns their fur white. And there's something kind of otherworldly about seeing what an animal that you're used to seeing as black and shadowy and blending in really well at the forest. You see the spirit bear just step out in the shadowy stream and they just stand out so much because they are so pale compared to their surroundings. There's something, yeah, I can see why they're called the spirit bear. Like there's something almost spiritual about it. It's quite remarkable. But research shows that the spirit bears may actually have a slightly bit of an advantage fishing for salmon during the daytime, because from the perspective of a salmon in the water looking up at a black bear with black fur stands out against the sky. A spirit bear blends in quite well with like a bright cloudy sky because they're white, so they blend in with the clouds. So it's been determined that the spirit bears may actually have a bit of an advantage fishing. Now there are only somewhere between estimated maybe 50 to 150 spirit bears in the entire world. And they are all in the Great Bear Rainforest. And we were blessed this past season. This bear, known as Strawberry, she's 8 years old in this photo. She had a cub. Um, who one of our one of the guests in my group proposed the cub should be named Blackberry, which I think would be fitting. But as you can see here, just because a spirit bear is white doesn't mean that their cub is going to be white. It depends on who they mated with. So if two spirit bears mate, the cub will be white. If a spirit bear mates with a black bear, the cub could be white or black, depending on the genes of the black bear. So if the black bear carries that genes, the cub could be white. But if they don't, the cub will definitely be black. So her cub this year was black. Now, all of these bears and all of these animals play a very important role in the salmon run. So they are obviously eating the salmon, and it's important for their own survival. In fact, the number of cubs that bears have every year is completely controlled by how well fed they were before they hibernated. So if they've been eating lots of salmon, they have more cubs. But it's not just the bears that the salmon are really important to. A lot of birds scavenge on the salmon as well. Here's a crow kind of approaching a salmon carcass, and this is a salmon that was caught by a bear. So the bears eat the salmon. When the salmon are plentiful, they don't eat the whole salmon. Sometimes they just eat parts of the salmon. This crow came in to finish it off. Eagles, as we talked about, also eat the salmon. And one thing that all these animals are doing is they are grabbing the salmon from the river, and often the eagles fly into the trees, or the bears maybe pick up the salmon and they carry them off into the forest. And regardless of where they eat the salmon, when they poop out to the waste afterwards, they are spreading these nutrients from the salmon throughout the forest. So when you walk through a forest near a stream that has spawning salmon in it, sometimes quite far away from the forest, it's not that unusual to see like the face of a salmon looking up at you beneath the falling leaves, because they are brought there by all the bears and the other animals. And it turns out that this has an incredibly important role in the forest, because these salmon, they decompose into the soil, their nutrients fertilize the soil and greatly increase the rate at which the forest grows. So the salmon brought there by the eagles and the bears and the wolves are quite literally feeding the forest itself and making the trees grow faster and making the trees grow bigger. And they can see, like, if a tree is cut or if a tree falls and they look at the tree rings, the years that the tree has the thickest rings are directly correlated with the years that had the most salmon in the river. So it's this incredible interconnected ecosystem, and the salmon are quite literally a part of growing the forest that all these other animals live in. So I think this is a beautiful example of an immensely interconnected ecosystem, and I love kind of trying to capture the photos that try to tell this amazing story. Now, I really wanted to capture a photo that captured as much of this story in one image as possible, right? The salmon are in the rivers, they are feeding the bears and feeding the forest. I want to capture all of this in one photo. And this is what I came up with. This photo here is half above water, half underwater, and it showcases a black bear above the surface, a pink salmon below the surface, and the forest behind. Now, this is the type of photo that you don't just show up to the river one day and snap this photo. This is the type of photo that takes a lot of planning. So first of all, the background knowledge, which is, I guess, kind of years worth of knowledge of like knowing where and when to go look for bears and when to go look for salmon. But a couple summers ago, I gave myself a week and I said, I want to try to get this photo. I'm going to take about a week to do it. So first step, I had some ideas of where to look, but I decided, okay, I'm going to photograph on this river. But I needed to find within the river the perfect spot where there would be a constant stream of salmon swimming by, and also it had to be a place where there was a regular, flow of bears going by with calm enough water to get a nice separation between above and below the surface. And it took a few days to hone in on the perfect spot. And then after like maybe 3 days of going around to different rivers, it took 3 days at this river with the camera in the water before I got this photo. And the way I captured this was I set up the camera in the water, and then I just set it to take a photo every single second all day. And I would go in every 2 or 3 hours to change the memory card and batteries. But then I would wait, a few hundred yards away because I didn't want to. If I was sitting right by the river, I feel like, some of the bears don't really care, but also I don't really want to insert myself into their environment too much. So I kind of waited a few hundred meters away and after 3 days, this moment happened where I captured the bear and the salmon in the same shot. So that's a little bit of a look at my corner of the world, the coast here of British Columbia. But I wanted to move on now to another environment, which is also quite close to home. One of the amazing things about living in British Columbia is we don't only have access to the ocean, we've also got access to the mountains. So the next series of images I want to share with you are from the mountains of Western Canada. Now, whenever I think of a place like mountains, I think of the beauty, I think of the grandeur. And when I photograph it, I want to take the approach where I'm showcasing that beauty and grandeur. Because not only are these mountains home to amazing things, they are beautiful. So it's nice to showcase wildlife within the context of that beautiful environment. This is one of the most unique mountain birds out there. This is the white-tailed ptarmigan. Ptarmigan, you'll see more photos of them in a moment here, but they actually change their feathers throughout the seasons to match their surroundings. So in the winter, they're pure white. In the summer, they turn kind of rock colored. And they're often, especially this species, the white-tailed ptarmigan, they're often very obliging. So it's the perfect species to get up close with like a wider angle lens. This was at 40 millimeters f4. And I captured this ptarmigan perched on a rock with the beautiful Rocky Mountains in the background. And when possible, I like to take this approach, just trying to showcase the environment in the photo. Here's another example of that. This is a mountain goat, and that's the sun setting between the goat's legs. This was kind of deliberately angling it to get this composition. And there's a nice starburst on the sun there, which you achieve by using a small aperture. So this was at, I can't remember exactly, but probably around f16 or so. And when you shoot with a small aperture, point sources of light, like the sun in a wide angle field of view, become beautiful starbursts. So this was a deliberate use of camera settings in order to achieve this effect. Now, when I think of the mountains of Western Canada, I usually say my favorite mountain area is this area known as the Haines Triangle, which is this far northwestern part of British Columbia, kind of sandwiched between the Yukon and Alaska, close to Haines, Alaska. Hence the name, the Haines Triangle. It's called the Triangle because on the map it's shaped like a triangle. And there's some amazing birds found in this area. Once again, you can hear applying that concept of capturing wildlife within their environments. This is an Arctic tern, which is one of my two favorite birds in the world. These birds spend the breeding season in the north, as far north as the high Arctic. They migrate all the way to Antarctica in the non-breeding season, and then come all the way back the next year to their exact same breeding grounds. It's a journey that can be close to 100,000 kilometers or close to 60,000 miles every year, which is absolutely ridiculous. This one here is another shot of an Arctic tern. This was on a really kind of stormy day. And I actually really like photographing on these more stormy days just because you get really dramatic clouds. And that's also an element of the environment that I like to capture. The Haines Triangle is also an area where we get a lot of nesting shorebirds. So you've got a lot of that kind of northerly tundra habitat. So a lot of really cool species. Here's an example of semi-palmated plover. I'm used to seeing these on the beaches and migration, but up there you see them in the mountains and in the tundra. And again, here, this was shot, I think this was shot at like 400 millimeters, but from further away to capture this beautiful mountain in the background. In the wetlands, there's all sorts of cool birds. This is where a lot of like trumpeter swans nest. And it's, again, every year I go there. This is another place where I guide tours. Every year that I go there, you get to see the swans in the same wetlands every year, and just thinking about where they've been since you last saw them is very cool. And they made their way back here just like I did. Now, one thing I often try to do when photographing is, in addition to just paying attention to the environment in general in composition, very specifically, there's a phrase that is often used in photography: see beyond the subject. So pay attention to the background. But in addition to seeing beyond the subject, I also think it's really important to see in front of the subject. And I often like to purposely kind of place some vegetation, some foliage in the foreground to kind of add some depth to the scene and further kind of immerse the subject within its environment. And often just by getting kind of a lower, more eye angle perspective, you kind of do this very easily because by getting low, you see some of those bushes and some of those grasses in the foreground. But there's all sorts of cool birds in this area. Here's another one that nests in the wetlands. This is a short-eared owl. I see them in the winter down around here in Vancouver, and then in the summer, I often see them up in the mountains in the north, like places like the Haines Triangle. So every year I guide a tour there in June, which is right when kind of the snow is melting in the Alpine. It's right when spring is arriving, and it's when things like grizzly bears start emerging. This was a really cool moment on one of the tours last year. This bear, we saw it walking across the tundra, and there was a patch of snow ahead. And I was thinking, I said to everyone like, "Oh, get ready! It might walk across that patch of snow. That'd be really cool." And sure enough, the bear walked right across the patch of snow. And I always just love when animals are in snow because it really adds, it's like a built-in reflector, right? It just bounces light underneath them, really shows you the details in the fur, the details in their eyes, really, really nicely. This is also in the northwest of British Columbia, a mama bear crossing the road with her three cubs. And super adorable. Also, makes me think about, what's going through the head of this family of bears as they cross this road. Is it daunting? Are they curious? Are they scared? Hard to know for sure. But certainly, just the way, that one sibling had its arm on the other one's arm, kind of holding it back, was very, very interesting to observe. I'm also a real fan of the underappreciated animals, little things like porcupines. Often see porcupines up there. This was right at sunset, which in that region in the summer is like 11:30 p.m. And really soft, like the last rays of light behind the subject. And you can see how that's lighting up, giving some rim light kind of to the edges of the porcupine. But because it's just the last little bit of light, it's not harsh, right? If you shoot with backlight into the sun in the middle of the day, it can be very high contrast. But because this is right at like dusk, right at sunset, it's just this beautiful, soft backlight. Perhaps the most elusive animal I've ever photographed up there is this one. This is a Canada lynx, which they are around, but we do not see them very often. Um, they're just very, very elusive. They're also cyclical, so in some years there's a lot more of them than others. But I've had just a few encounters with these cats, but they are so, so beautiful. Also, they often kind of completely ignore you. Like this one, it completely ignored me, and then it just gave this little look over, and I captured this photo, and then it kept going on its way. Now, just back to some birds here. This part of the world is the best place I've ever experienced. This northwestern part of British Columbia called the Haines Triangle for ptarmigan. Um, and I call the spring season up there, May, June, I call it hormonal chicken season because the ptarmigan are all their chickens basically. And they're all just like strutting around, making funny sounds in the patches of snow and in the tundra. And it's just a lot of fun to photograph them. They're actually all three species of ptarmigan in the world can be found there. And it's one of the only places on Earth where all three species can be found. So this is the willow ptarmigan. This here is the rock ptarmigan, captured with some of that environment in the background. This is what it often looks like in kind of that June time of year when the snow is melting. And then these here are white-tailed ptarmigan. So that's the male on the top of the hill. And then you can look closely just to the left of him. You can see there's a female tucked into the grass there as well. These are just such cool birds. And one of the reasons I think they're really cool birds is because in the wintertime, they look like this. They completely turn white and they perfectly camouflage into the snow. And the next series of photos I'm going to show you here are photos showcasing the Canadian winter. Because yes, it might be cold in certain areas, but the animals in the snow just make for a spectacular photography environment. You can see this ptarmigan is following the tracks of another ptarmigan. This is a willow ptarmigan. They're pure white, but when they fly, they actually have a little bit of black in their tail. So you see the little black tails flying across the snow, and then you look closely and you're like, oh, there's a bird attached to that black tail that's going by. When you get these white snowy conditions, they just camouflage so incredibly well. Now, for me personally, the most spectacular scenery I've ever seen in the world is up in this kind of northern British Columbia, southern Yukon region. This is kind of what some of the scenery looks like in the wintertime. In the wintertime, everything is just blanketed in snow. Absolutely gorgeous. I do a summer trips to this area. I'm currently developing a winter trip. I think 2027, I will launch a winter trip to this area as well, just to photograph, these animals and the scenery and the northern lights too in this amazing winter environment. Animals are obviously not hugely abundant in the winter, but there are some species that you can find. One of my favorites to watch are foxes. This was a really windy day. You can see the fox squinting into the wind parting the fur of that fox. And by getting a low angle here, I could see the wind blowing the snow over the feet. And see that little extra element of like the snow, the feet disappearing into the blowing snow, just in even a pure white scene like this, just gives that little bit extra sense of what it was like, in my opinion. Um, Now, this photo was at 500 millimeters. This photo here was at like 100 millimeters. The foxes are there in the snow mousing, so they pounce into the air and they dive into the snow. They hear mice underneath the snow, and then using their hearing, they pounce on them and pull them out of the snow. And part of the scene is just the vastness of it all. And in this photo here, I wanted to capture that vastness. So yes, I photographed some close shots of the passing, but also zoomed out to capture the context of the environment. And again, the winter environment up there is just beautiful. Here's another species, the Dall's sheep, which is a relative of the bighorn sheep, but they're white to blend in with the snow. Here's another Dall's sheep. This was a cool sunrise. The sun was hitting the mountain behind, but it wasn't yet hitting the mountain that the sheep was on. So it was really like high contrast, and this sheep was silhouetted in front of the mountain in the back that had the sun on it. And it made for a cool photo. Back to the birds here. Other than the ptarmigan, one of the only birds that can survive the winter, often in the high mountain areas, are ravens. And in some areas, ravens can be quite obliging and quite used to people. Um, I was actually, this scene here, I was photographing that one raven with a wide angle lens, just sitting in the snow. I was sitting with it there, and it was sitting in the snow, and it was beautiful. I was really liking the shot, but I was thinking, we got the lighting, we got the composition. Now, if we could just add that behavior element or something kind of interesting, some action, that would be really nice. And then all of a sudden I noticed the raven starts to like look up, and it's looking over. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this second raven flying. And I knew it had to be coming. And so I just got really ready. And just in time, as the raven swooped in, I held down my finger on the shutter and I got this photo of the second raven coming in to join the first raven, which was really beautiful and resulted in this photo here. Now, another group of birds that I love photographing in the Canadian winter are owls. There's so many species of owls that we get, and winter is the best time to look for them. The environment is beautiful with the snow. There's less leaves on the trees, so they're easier to find, and we just get more of them coming to more like southern Canada in the winter. A lot of them disperse up north in the summer. This is a northern pygmy owl. Here's a great horned owl. Here's another great horned owl in a nest cavity. This was actually just in this past February. I do annual photography trips in Alberta with my guests focused on photographing owls, but completely in kind of like a respectful, ethical way. We're just out there looking for the natural behaviors. We're not like baiting the owls. We're just watching them hunt and trying to get natural photos of the natural owl behaviors. And this was a beautiful nest that we photographed on one of the trips this year. The owl just sleeping in the cavity there. But we get all sorts of species. The one owl that I think often people are very excited about specifically is the great gray owl. This past winter was a phenomenal year for great gray owls. We had so many incredible great gray owl photo opportunities and beautiful light. This lighting here is some kind of soft evening backlights kind of lighting up the great gray owl from behind, and the background there is largely in the shade. And the eyes were just glowing beautifully. So that was really nice. Here's another photo. This is with some sunrise backlight, and there's a little bit foggy, and it just lights up the scene so beautifully. But these great gray owls are so much fun to watch because they're really active during these morning and evening hours. So there's lots of opportunities to photograph them out and about hunting and diving into the snow. They're really exciting to photograph. My personal favorite owl species, though, is the northern hawk owl, which is this one. Just because, I don't know, there's something about them. They're super unique looking. They're not an owl that like people who aren't versed in the world of owls and photography maybe even know exists. And they're also one that's very active during the day. Like in the middle of the day, like noon, they'll sometimes be out and about flying around and hunting. And they're also, when they're out and about, quite easy to spot. They sit right on the tops of the trees. These trips with the owls, they rely very heavily on scouting. So before my guests arrive, I'll spend a couple weeks out there scouting, finding as many owls as possible. And kind of once you find the general areas where the owls are around, they're not going to be in the exact same places either every day, But if you know where in the environment to look for them, it really increases your chances of being able to find them. For example, hawk owls, I'm always looking at the tips of the trees. And sometimes they have very, very favorite trees and patches of trees, and they'll just keep flying in when they hunt to the same treetops, which provides opportunities for flight shots like this one. Now, for a long time, I've wanted to photograph an owl in front of the moon, and I'd made some attempts, some successful, some not, but I hadn't really gotten a photo I was really, really happy with until this last year when I was in Alberta for the photography workshops, and this happened. Managed to line up a northern hawk owl with the rising near full moon. Um, it was just everything lined up and made for a gorgeous photo. So this isn't like a photoshopped in moon or anything. This is in camera, a single exposure of the northern hawk owl directly in front of the rising moon, which I'll show you some more of that sort of stuff later on here. The other owl that we see on the trips is this one, the snowy owl, which I think is often people's favorite. And I can see why. They're just so beautiful. They're just so built for their environment, pure white with those bright yellow eyes. All right, so I showed you a bunch of photos here from the cold, from the mountains, from the windy coast. So I wanted to diversify it a bit and take you to one tropical destination, and that is going to be Ecuador. This is another place where I have been fortunate to guide photography trips and had a great time there this past October, November guiding a photography trip. This is probably my favorite bird in Ecuador, the sword-billed hummingbird. And the beauty of Ecuador is it's so well set up for visiting, similar to Costa Rica, very well set up for visiting birders and photographers, very comfortable accommodations and great, like hummingbird feeders where the birds just have no fear of people whatsoever. And you can get in there like this with a wide angle lens and capture really creative photos. For my trips, we spend part of the time in the Andes. That's Cotopaxi volcano actually erupting a little bit in the background there with a rufous-bellied seed snipe in the foreground in the Andes. But the real highlight in the Andes are all the hummingbirds. This is natural light on a tourmaline sun angel. This is a velvet purple coronet. Hummingbirds have amazing names, don't they? This here is a sparkling violet ear. So I think on our last tour there, we photographed like 50 species of hummingbirds, something absolutely crazy like that. It's an amazing place. Here's another cool bird in the Andes, the plate-billed mountain toucan. And this will for always be a special species for me because all the way back in I want to say 2017, this was the 1,000th bird species that I'd ever seen, was the plate-billed mountain toucan. So now whenever I see a plate-billed mountain toucan, I'm always very excited because it was my 1,000th bird. Now, part of the trips we are in the the Andes. The other part of the trips I'm in Ecuador, I'm in the Amazon, which is also home to some amazing birds like these hoatzins. If you look closely there, there's a baby sticking out from under the wing. But for me, the best part about the Amazon are the claylix, which are these places where you get tons of parrots and parakeets and macaws gathering to eat clay, which is basically like for them Pepto-Bismol for toxic fruits. So they get stomach aches because they eat toxic fruits, and then they cure their stomach aches with the minerals and nutrients found in clay. And these places are just magical. It's always the highlight for me of these trips to Ecuador is visiting the clay licks. Here you can see these are scarlet macaws and orange cheek parrots. I'm using, again, like I talked about earlier, that slow shutter speed technique to get that blur in the wings. Same thing here with these cobalt winged parakeets using a slow shutter speed to capture the motion in the wings. One more example of that here as all these cobalt winged parakeets took off. That really captures the blur. But one thing I like about this photo is that even though it's blurry, there are still sharp parakeets, especially that one in the bottom right at the bottom to kind of anchor the composition and have all that colorful chaos stemming off of it. Now, this year when we were in the Amazon, we also had amazing clear dark skies and got spectacular astrophotography opportunities here. Which leads me into the final topic for my presentation today, which is a little bit of nighttime stuff. So I have long been passionate about birds and wildlife and photographing them. But when I was in grade 8, I had a science teacher. His name was Mr. Prosick, who did a unit on astronomy. And I'd already been well into photographing at this time, but Mr. Prosick was a phenomenal teacher, so inspiring. And after his astronomy unit, I decided I was going to go out and photograph the night sky for the first time. Now, this ended up, you know, just ended up becoming a huge passion of mine, the night sky photography. And I started doing a lot of night sky photography, stuff like this. This is hours worth of exposure time using all sorts of advanced concepts like modified cameras to see infrared light and special filters to capture hydrogen alpha light and star trackers and all that sort of stuff. So very advanced sort of stuff. But when I was doing this astrophotography, I started thinking, you know what would be cool? What if I could combine my love for the night and photographing at night, this newfound hobby that I had when I was in grade 8, thanks to Mr. Prosick? What if I could combine that with my existing passion for bird photography? So I began trying to photograph birds at night. Now, this could be in any number of environments. For example, here in the west coast of Canada, in our urban cities, we get some very cool urban wildlife. This was actually on the night of Halloween, a barred owl in downtown Vancouver on the night of Halloween. I've been looking for barred owls for years in the city, trying to get a photo like this without any luck. And then on Halloween, a friend of mine spotted one, and I rushed downtown and managed to capture this photo here. But I wanted not just to capture, birds in front of the urban environments at night. I also wanted to capture in front of, the stars and the night sky. So I spent some time in the desert of California trying to track down great horned owls. And I managed to capture this photo here. So this is a great horned owl with the starry night sky in the background. And the way this came about is so many times I'd been out there in the desert photographing the Milky Way, photographing the night sky, and I kept hearing great horned owls. And I thought, you know what? I bet you if I just walk towards where I hear these owls, I'll be able to find them because they don't sound like they're that far away. I don't know why it took me so many years to try this. Maybe you have to spend enough time out in the desert alone at night to build up the guts to do this sort of thing. But I decided I'd go out try to find the great horned owls. Sure enough, found a pair on the tops of these Joshua trees and managed to capture this photo here. This was a 4-second exposure at f1.6 at 105 millimeters. And ISO, I think like 10,000. So really getting a ton of light in the frame. This past almost a year ago now, we had a bright northern lights storm. And you may remember in May 2024, northern lights showed up all over the world, including here in Vancouver. And my goal that night was photographing birds in front of the northern lights. And it was successful. I managed to capture this photo here of a great blue heron underneath those dancing northern lights, which was a dream come true. If you look closely, it even has a little bit of a fish in its beak. And I also managed to capture these Canada geese as well beneath the northern lights. So it was a real dream come true to capture birds with northern lights. I've also gone on a bit of a kick lately of trying to photograph birds with eclipses. So this was just this past month. This is a crow in front of, there was a lunar eclipse in March. And lots of planning and preparation goes into all of these, but I went to a local crow roost and managed to capture some crows in front of that lunar eclipse. Here's a couple more photos of that. And one more. So that was awesome. That was something that I'd been planning for a while. I also just a few days ago, there was a partial solar eclipse in the Northeast. I just got back home, and I flew from Vancouver to Quebec, chasing clear skies to photograph this solar eclipse sunrise. And I managed to photograph this American black duck in front of the rising solar eclipse, which was also a dream come true for me. Something I'd had my eyes on for a very, very long time. The thing that all of these kind of night sky with birds photos have in common is tons of planning, tons of scouting, tons of preparation, because they're very challenging technically. They're very challenging in terms of finding the perfect location. And then you only have sometimes like a few minutes to get the perfect shot. So everything has to line up just right. Now, my dream photo, though, for a couple years was a bird in front of a total solar eclipse. Now, I'm sure maybe some of you here have seen total solar eclipses. It's an awe-inspiring phenomenon. I think there's very few things. I don't think there's anything I've experienced actually as spectacular as a total solar eclipse. But photographing a bird in front of one is challenging because total solar eclipses only happen like on average once every 18 months. They last just a few minutes and they occur on very narrow and very specific areas. It's not like you can just be anywhere in the world or anywhere on a continent. You have to be in a very specific spot. So when I was planning this, my eye immediately went to an eclipse happening on April 8th, 2024. So almost exactly a year ago. And when this is the map here, that dotted line, the path of totality. So I had to be somewhere on that line. And immediately I thought coast of Mexico, because the coast of Mexico, I know I've been there before. There's tons of seabirds. I know that's going to be a really good spot for it. So I spent just an insane amount of time planning, virtually researching. Then I spent a week in person scouring the coast of Sinaloa, finding the perfect place. And ultimately, I chartered a boat. I had a couple local guys take me out to these rocky islands offshore, which were home to a lot of magnificent frigate birds. And importantly, there would be frigate birds there in the daytime. And I watched this every evening. And at evening, they would all come into these islands and roost, which is really important because during a total solar eclipse, day turns into night. So it's reasonable to believe that birds might go to their roost. So after, over a year and a half of intensively working on this, during the 4 minutes and 20 seconds of totality off of the coast of Mazatlan, my dream photo came together, and I managed to capture this photo here of a magnificent frigate bird in front of the total solar eclipse. And this photo here is very specifically the phase of the eclipse known as the diamond ring, which lasts like 5 seconds maybe, when the edge of the sun is peeking out just a little bit on the side of the moon. Now, I actually got lots of photos of frigate birds in front of the eclipse because I was in a really perfect spot using the boat. I could get right under them. But I just got lucky that that frigate bird flew by the eclipse right during that instance of the diamond ring. And I got myself in the right place in the right time with the right camera settings to pull it off. And I was very excited and very happy. My friend Jack, who's a film director, I brought him down and he filmed the behind the scenes video. So that's a screenshot of the video on the right. I was smiling very big afterwards. I was very happy. There's a full behind the scenes video on my YouTube channel. And that's a photo on the left, a post-eclipse selfie. Arturo and Tony were the local captains who were driving the boats. And then my friend Jack filming the behind the scenes. So before I wrap up here, I hope you don't mind me doing just a quick little self-plug here. If you would like to join me on one of my photography adventures, I would love to have you. A lot of these trips are already sold out, but on screen here, you can see the various trips that I have coming up in the next year or so. I have bald eagle and coastal wildlife photography workshops out of Vancouver Island every year. Those are fabulous to work on, like birds in flight and action photography. We're photographing from boats. I do Great Bear Rainforest trips every year. My 2025 trip sold out, but I'll be announcing 2026 dates soon, looking for the spirit bear, grizzly bears, sometimes wolves, humpback whales, eagles, all that sort of stuff. I do a trip every year to Ecuador to photograph all the tropical birds. I also do a trip in the Haines Triangle in the mountains, which is not specifically a photography workshop, though it's photographer friendly, but kind of anyone, birder, photographer, naturalist, everyone's welcome. And one of my favorites has to be the Owl of Alberta trip, ethical owl photography workshop. Just I scout for weeks and we go out there. I just announced it a few days ago and there's only one spot remaining. So if you would like to come, definitely let me know. Here on screen is all of my info. So if you want to sign up for my monthly newsletter, the link is on screen there. My website and social media and email are on screen as well. Feel free to email me at any time if you have any questions, comments about photography, if you have anything exciting you want to share, if you are interested in a trip, don't hesitate to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. But yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming to the presentation. I hope you enjoyed the photos, and thanks so much, Linda, for having me. It's really been a pleasure. And I guess if anyone has questions, I'm also more than happy to answer.
I was gonna say, if you don't mind, take down your screen. There is one
Okay.
question in the chat, and I'll look here for it.
Here we go.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say thanks for bringing all the pretty pictures because there was not one bad picture in that. Oh my gosh.
Oh, thank
I
you.
mean, sometimes I think, wow, how do you pick a favorite? I don't know how you would pick a favorite. Yeah, you've had a beautiful portfolio, a lot of wonderful experiences, and gosh, as somebody actually texted me and went, "Oh my God, his photos are amazing."
Oh, very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay. I believe this is Andy's question. He's noticing, well, the different focal lengths you're using are making your photos really unique. Can you talk about the lens that you're carrying? I mean, is it like he thinks it may be a 24 to 240, but what are you really carrying in the field?
That's a really, really great question. So the lens that I have on my camera most of the time is the Canon 100 to 500 millimeter RF lens. So my main gear is a Canon R5 with the Canon 100 to 500 millimeter RF lens. So that's the lens I have on most of the time. However, when I actually look at my portfolio of favorite images, I think like a good half of them are probably taken with like some kind of more wide angle focal length, even though most of the time I have an 100 to 500 on. A lot of my favorite photos are taken with a more wide angle lens. I'm a big fan of like the 24 to 105 millimeter range. I've used the f4 version, and Canon also now has an f2.8 version, which I haven't purchased yet, but I've rented one and now I want to buy one. It's just a little expensive, but that's cool to have f2.8 in a 24 to 105. I think if there was like a 24 to 240 for Canon that was like nice high image quality, I would definitely gravitate towards something like that because I think I enjoy having that versatility and being able to, yeah, just capture the close-ups, the medium shots, and the wide angles. All that said, I do firmly believe that the gear is not as important as what you do with the gear. Yes, having the best cameras and the best lenses is helpful. But I've never shot really with the best cameras and the best lenses. I mean, the R5 is certainly an exceptional camera. I'd put it up there with the best. But the vast majority of my time, I've been using much less expensive gear. There's even a video on YouTube you can find where I try to capture photos with like of birds with like just a phone. And I think it's all about what you choose to photograph and how you choose to photograph. Because no, you're not going to get close-ups of bears with a phone, but you could probably get really cool photos of like birds flying overhead in front of like a dramatic sky or something like that. So I think the technique matters more than the gear. But yes, I'm a big fan of that like zoom lens sort of scenario. And I do use my 100 to 500 a lot, and I regularly am zooming out all the way to 100 millimeters or switching to like a 24 to 105 or something like that.
Do you have any primes that you use?
Um, I have the only prime that I regularly use I have is like a 14 millimeter 1.8, which I use for a lot of like nighttime stuff. Um, I don't really regularly shoot with primes other than that. Obviously, primes tend to be sharper and faster autofocusing and lighter traditionally, though in the modern era of like the newest, latest, and greatest lenses, that's hardly even really true anymore because a lot of the newest zoom lenses are sharper and faster than the primes used to be just a few years ago. So I am a big fan of zoom lenses for the versatility that they give me because I often find there's not like I just often find myself shooting at 500, zooming out to 100, or shooting at 100, zooming out to 24, and just capturing with different focal lengths. So I really enjoy personally having the versatility of a zoom lens. Though I've also heard like the perspective, which I completely respect and agree with, which is that using a prime lens, a fixed focal length, can help people with creativity too, and also help them hone in on specific things because it can be, I've heard, like overwhelming for some people to use a zoom lens. Like, what should I do? Whereas if you have a prime lens, you pick your focal length, and then you can focus on your composition and your lighting and that sort of thing. You don't have to worry too much about, how zoomed in you are. So I think there's a place for both. But me personally, I mostly photograph with zoom lenses.
Okay. Do you have any, can you make any comments on your editing workflow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, so I, generally speaking, like to take a fairly photojournalistic approach to my editing. I don't enjoy, like vastly altering the scene or removing or adding stuff like that. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that. I think photography is an art, so I feel like if that's what you want to do, like that is great. Like why not? It's an art. You should be able to do that. I do think though that there is sometimes a responsibility in wildlife photography just because like people see photos who aren't photographers and they expect them to be completely real. So I guess me personally, I do tend to take a more photojournalistic approach, but that doesn't mean that I'm not editing. In fact, I do quite a bit of like dodging and burning where I'll like mask the subject, maybe lighten up the subject a bit and darken the background a bit and kind of get the lighting of the photo exactly how I want it to be. But all, without, in my opinion, like dramatically altering the feel of the photo. And in many cases, when you're working with like a raw file, I do think the raw file out of the camera doesn't look anything nearly as nice as what it may have looked like with your eyes. And often it actually takes some editing and enhancing of the lighting and the color a little bit to make it pop like you experienced it with your eyes.
Okay, let me sneak this in here because it's a good question. Jan's question is, how strenuous are your workshops?
That's a good question too. Um, I specifically design the vast majority of my workshops to be very accessible. So very unstrenuous. Um, Most of the time, like the hiking or any of that is very limited. We're mostly photographing in a very accessible way, either very close to our boats or from a boat, just sitting down, or in Ecuador, we're usually staying pretty close to the lodge. That said, sometimes I'll have different offerings. Like some trips, I'll have a second guide. So if people, maybe we'll spend some time watching the hummingbird feeders, but then if people want to go off for a little bit more of a hike, they can do so. So I do, like to have the options for people. But no, my workshops, um, they are not super strenuous. I do myself often find myself in strenuous terrain just when I'm out on my own crazy photo adventures and stuff. But I design my photo workshops knowing that, a lot of the people, most of the people who want to go on those trips are not up for like massive hikes, especially carrying all their camera gear. So they are very accessible. Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, Liren, this was amazing. I'm the one that struck there a lot of your photos just struck my just that jaw drop. But the one that just absolutely blew me away was the great horned owl under the stars. It's
Mm.
like, oh my God. So the creativity there and just okay. So yeah, I'm inspired.
Thank you.
And now I need to find an owl. So I want to thank you for coming and sharing some of your photos, probably a very small amount of them, and the stories behind them. And you peppered them with some tips for us. And I'm going to share with you the chat and everything, so you'll have it. But the chat just kept bouncing, and I'm like, "Is that a? That's not a question. It's all these very nice comments." This isn't a very nice group. I'll start with that. So they don't. There's no surprise that the comments are nice, but they're still popping in there. So I definitely want to put that in front of you. So thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. I know you just got back from a trip, and I'm gonna let you rest up, and I'm gonna hit you up again for maybe another return to
Yeah, I'd love
the
to.
hour. All right. Next week, Lynn's baby ambassador Kathy Coleman will be here with her presentation, Botanicals, the Big, the Macro, and the Abstract. Until next time, stay inspired and keep creating. We can't wait to see you again soon.